I don't have a particularly large amount of material tonight that I want to cover, although knowing me, I can probably still fill up my hour's time, but I could cram some more material in here, but I think that I won't, because I want to concentrate on something that's rather elementary, but then we've got new people in the church, and maybe even some of the old ones aren't all aligned in their thinking concerning some things about the temple. And we're going to be continuing this next Friday night, Lord willing, as we look at the Greek words for temple, the hieron and the naos in the New Testament, show you what the difference is. And it really, I think, well, at least it did for me, it really will enlighten your eyes, open your eyes to understanding the physical, visible, geographical setting of the Gospels better. So let me start by saying our general topic tonight is going to be the building of Herod's temple. Last week was an introduction to the temple of the intertestamental period by going back as far as the tabernacle in the wilderness and following the construction of Solomon's temple right on down through Zerubbabel down to the intertestamental period. Herod himself is an intertestamental period figure. He comes on the scene as king of Judea in 37 B.C. or 40 B.C., depending on which way you're going to count that. We'll see that in just a moment. But what this temple is often referred to, and you need to remember this in your readings, is the second temple, and therefore anything that concerns that is known as the Second Temple period, or it falls in the Second Temple period. In other words, that would be everything from 536 BC to AD 70. There'll be several things like this that I want to just say tonight that you might not have known, or you might have known, but I want to concentrate on so you'll remember it. The Jews count two temples, Solomon's and Herod's. And all the Jewish writings, when you read the Talmud and the Mishnah and things like this, if it talks about something during the Second Temple period versus the First Temple period, then it's talking about this period from 536 BC to AD 70. In other words, when we were closing out our study last Friday night, we looked at 5 things which, according to the Talmud, were not in Zerubbabel's temple: the Holy Spirit, the sacred lot, and the divine fire, and so forth. So what they would do, I didn't specify all of this last week because I knew we would be dealing with it now. They would say that these things were absent from the Second Temple. Or if they're talking about certain religious developments, they'll say, for instance, these developments characterize the First Temple period. So you know you're talking about pre-exilic Old Testament history, from the time of Solomon down to the time of Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel. If they say, well, these events characterize the Second Temple period, which is entirely different in their whole theology. They arrange some of their theology around the First Temple period and the Second Temple period. Then they're talking about the post-exilic period that runs from 536, the time of the laying of the foundation of the Second Temple under Zerubbabel, down to the final destruction of it under Titus, the Roman general, in AD 70. So it's called the Second Temple or the Second Temple period. Other people refer to it by other names, this temple. Some people refer to it as Zerubbabel's temple, meaning really the same thing if they knew that it was the Second Temple, or that was an available name. They would mean the same thing by it. Other people refer to it as Herod's temple. Now, another thing that I want to specify here. Now, this may have never caused any confusion in your mind, but then again, maybe you've never thought of it, so maybe that's why it hasn't caused any confusion. Christian writers, especially dispensationalists, like to use the study of numbers whenever they're studying Scripture. And there's no doubt about the fact that there are important numbers in Scripture. Why do we see the number 12 or the number 40 or the number 7 or the number 3 or the number 10 or the number 666? Why do we see numbers like that unless there's something significant about them? And I think that there is. Sometimes people are a little artificial, I think, in their arrangement and their desire to make sure it fits number 3 or 6 or 7 or 10 or 12 or 40 or whatever. And so a lot of Christian people will tell us that there are, or were, or will be, 7 Jewish temples. So why don't you help me list these in chronological order, what they would be then? Number 1 would be what? Zerubbabel. Where's everybody? 3. Herod's.
Millennial.
Boy, I thought we were doing this in order. Okay, now I think we need to do something with order here, though. Tabernacle, they would have as number 1. Then we move Solomon down 1, Zerubbabel down 1, Herod down 1. We would swap tribulation and millennial, and we'd go to New Jerusalem, all right? So what we need to do it again. We would have the tabernacle, Solomon, Zerubbabel, Herod, tribulation, millennial, and the eternal. Okay, and some biblical references for those. What would that be? Tabernacle? Well, you could just say Exodus, all right? Starts like it really gives a direction in 25 and following. Solomon, First Kings, but like 5 to 8, something like that. Zerubbabel. Okay, Ezra, like Ezra 3. Herod. Matthew. What Matthew? Better one be John 2. We'll look at that passage in a moment. Tribulation. Well, sure, you could have Revelation 11:2. I think a better known one is 2 Thessalonians 2. This is good dispensational theology, and I don't say that I disagree with it. I happen to agree with it. But of course, you've got to squeeze tabernacle in there and count it as a temple. It's not a temple, but if you're talking about dwelling places of God, then that would be okay, but then the Jews would probably have a problem with you whenever you get down here to tribulation and things like that. That God's going to come back into the temple again in the tribulation period. Millennial would be what? Yeah, Ezekiel, the well-known chapters 40 through 48. And then the eternal would be Revelation 21 and 22. Okay. Now I'll show you why I want to do this way. What happens here, my experience has been, and maybe my own thinking, maybe talking with others, maybe a combination of that, has been to see a tendency towards discontinuity in at least one of these situations. Now the tabernacle is just done away with. They build Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple is just destroyed by the Babylonians. They come back in Zerubbabel. We'll skip Zerubbabel. Herod builds the temple. It's just destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. According to 2 Thessalonians 2, evidently a temple is going to be built during the tribulation period. And since we're going to have a millennial one, evidently that will be destroyed. Then the millennial temple. Well, it may not be destroyed, but we're going to have a new situation, so it's gone. Then we have the eternal one, which will last forever. The problem, as you can see, revolves around Zerubbabel's temple as it relates to Herod's temple. I think that the common conception here is that we're dealing with two different temples, when in fact we're not. If we are, then I'd ask, what happened to Zerubbabel's then? Since we are dealing with a new one with Zerubbabel's, and we would ask then, well, what happened to Solomon's? Solomon's was destroyed. Then when we go down here and call Herod's a separate temple, then we would ask, what happened to Zerubbabel's? Well, it was destroyed. When was that? I didn't know that it was. Well, no record of it being destroyed at all. So this may be a little elementary to some of you, but I think it's essential that we start off with this, that when we're talking about the second temple, Zerubbabel's temple, Herod's temple, we're talking about the same thing. It's very fun to end up with numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so we've got a good perfect number 7, but in fact Zerubbabel's temple and Herod's temple are the same building. Nothing has been destroyed so that something is rebuilt on top of it. What we have, rather, on the other hand, is a very extensive renovation program carried out by the half-Jewish, half-Idumean king Herod in some of the early years, beginning in the early years of his reign. So I think it's probably more for convenience sake that we speak of two temples, Zerubbabel's and Herod's. In fact, they're the same thing. Nothing has happened to Zerubbabel's, and you need to just think about that for a moment. It lasts for 500 years, from 520 BC when it's completed, all the way down to 20 BC, whenever Herod builds his, almost to the day, almost literally to the day, a half a millennium. I mean, almost to the day, 500 years. Well, Solomon's didn't even last that long. Solomon's is done way down in the 960s BC, and it's destroyed in 586. Comes close to it, but not quite. So, basically, we've covered just about a period of 1,000 years. 500, a little bit short for Solomon's, and 500 almost to the T for Zerubbabel's. As we saw last time in Ezra chapter 3, I believe, the problem with Zerubbabel's was its smallness of size. Whenever the foundation is laid in Ezra chapter 3, the ancient men, the old men who lived in an earlier day and had seen Solomon's temple and were carried over into captivity and lived long enough evidently to come back, they were grieved in heart, and they cried out with much weeping whenever they saw the proportion of the temple by virtue of the fact of the laying of its foundation, that it could not be very great. And that was not because the Jews had lost some of their spirituality. It's because they had lost all their financial resources. You've got to remember, we're dealing with a returning exile people. They simply don't have the money. They don't have the wherewithal to lavish the gold, the silver, to import the cedar of Lebanon from up in Lebanon, as Solomon had done whenever he was king in a much earlier and a much more prosperous time, known as the first of two golden ages in ancient Israel. That is under the rulership of the kings. So we don't want to think of the people in Zerubbabel's time as being bad. Now, they were bad in one regard because they were building their own houses instead of the temple, and Haggai got onto them for that. But it's not because they didn't want to use all of the gold and silver they had on the temple. They simply didn't have it available. And as a result, you have a very impoverished-looking temple. But it suffices them for 500 years. For the washings, for the ceremonies, especially for the sacrifice and what have you, it lasts them for a long time. However, Herod comes on the scene in 40 BC. He officially is announced by the Romans as king of Judea in 37 BC. And in the 18th, according to Josephus, or the 15th, according to the Talmud, year of his reign, he begins a renovation expansion project. Now, we've covered on an earlier tape, I didn't take the time to look up what number it was in ITP, where we discussed the life and reign of Herod, the fact that there are two different ways of dating his reign. He comes and takes control of Palestine in 40 BC. He's not proclaimed officially king until 37. Hence the, on the surface, discrepancy between Josephus and the Talmud. Josephus said it was in the 18th year of King Herod, which would be around 20 to 19 BC. In the 18th year of King Herod, he began the renovation project. But he's counting from an earlier period. The Talmud said is in the 15th year of his reign. Well, the Talmud is counting from 37. So you see about a 3-year difference, a 3 to 4 year difference in the way that they are reckoning this. So allowing for parts of years, the date you always see in your reading will be, generally what I see is this, because you've got to deal with parts of years, 2019 BC. If you just remember one or the other, you've got it. 20 BC is a lot easier to remember since it's a round figure. But I always see 2019 BC because you've got to deal with halves of years. Well, Herod is not particularly a religious man himself. So you might ask the question, why? Why go to all the trouble and expense of the renovation on the temple? Well, there have been several different suggestions, and it's probably a combination of them, but it probably started with this. And we saw whenever we studied Herod that he was one who loved to build things. That's when I brought some of my slides and showed you all of the building work of King Herod. He was one who was very fascinated in showing off his abilities in construction. And so I think that's probably the basic reason he wants to do something to the temple, because he does it over the outcry of some of the Jewish religious leaders. They don't want him to bother their temple. But I think, secondly, as time goes on, the Jews get caught up into the whole business themselves of having a greater, more beautiful, more expansive and expensive temple, that they are in favor of what Herod is doing. And Herod, ever the one to catch the whim of the people and satisfy it if he can for his own advantage, I think he is doing it to curry the favor of the Jews. But I think that comes along later in the period of his reconstruction. So we'd say two things. You know, the temple doesn't mean anything to Herod personally, himself, religiously speaking. But he does it because he likes to build. Secondly, he does it as a political move to curry the favor of the Jews. And as I've said already, almost to the day, 500 years after Zerubbabel finished his work in 520 BC, then Herod begins to expand the temple of Zerubbabel. So it's okay with me to go according to this sevenfold figure here. It may be a little artificial, but and I guess the biggest problem I would have would be what I'm talking about now, counting Zerubbabel and Herod's temple as two different temples, because they're not. You're using the same one, simply expanding it. But it is tremendously different. I mean, significantly different. Herod's temple, especially by the time he's through with it, than was Zerubbabel's earlier. And you're certainly in two different periods of Israel's history. You're up into the life of Christ by the time Herod has been working at his temple for 5 decades. And you're way back in the post-exilic period whenever Zerubbabel is doing his. So let's start into giving you some of the information about the actual work itself, the work that Herod commissioned to be done on the temple. And what I want to do here is impress upon your mind the massive nature of it all. And I can only do that partially tonight. We'll have to do it more as we go along, looking at the Greek words in the New Testament and how they do differ from one another. And we look at the vast extent of the temple precincts and courts, often called the temple compound itself. Because the typical conception of the temple is like a church building, just one church building with maybe a parking lot outside, which would take up all of maybe an acre or 2 acres or 3 acres at the most. And Herod's temple is much, 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 much larger than that. And I think only when you understand that can you really understand the visible setting of the 4 Gospels, as well as some in the book of Acts. If you're trying to close your eyes mentally as you read and picture, now what's going on here? When it talks, for instance, I'll give you one for instance, over in Acts 4, or let's go to Acts 5, since they're threatened in 4 and it actually happens in 5. Whenever the apostles have disobeyed the Sanhedrin, they said, don't teach or preach in this name at all. And they said, we must obey God rather than men. I know they say that in chapter 5 and verse 29, but they're thrown into prison in chapter 5. Well, where was that prison? Well, what did it look like? And so when you see prison, you interpret that with your own background. You either think of medieval castles and dungeons, or you think of the old shoot-'em-ups out in Wyoming or something, in the movies, and you see the town sheriff. Or you think of a modern penitentiary with, barbed wire and the towers at 4 corners just bristling with guns and guards up there. You think of those things, and you don't really know what to do with the prison here. They were thrown into prison. Well, we'll get into that later on. It's not anything like I just described, the 3 different solutions you might have had. And it's right there in the temple itself. It's right there in that area. They don't have to go anywhere else. They're certainly not going to, if you thought fourthly, maybe you're talking about the castle or fortress of Antonia. That was a Roman station, a Roman garrison. The Jews would never have thrown their own religious prisoners into a Roman prison like that. And Antonia was not really a prison anyway. It was a fortress to hold a contingent of soldiers there to keep the peace in Jerusalem, especially in the temple area, with all of these Jewish religious zealots coming at a triannual festival season from all over the world. So what I'm saying is I want to impress on your mind the fact that it was a massive construction endeavor, greater than you can probably comprehend. Since stone was the chief building material, Herod began in 20 B.C., by preparing 1,000 wagons, along with the necessary several thousand oxen, in order to haul the stone once it had been quarried. The practice was, and this was true all over the Mediterranean Roman world of the 1st century B.C. or A.D., the practice was to cut the stone, form it, that is, quarry it, right in the pit itself, wherever the stone was found. And then to haul it in wagons, on sleds, on runners, the various ways they had of moving these immense stones. Some have been found, like one up in Baalbek. This is not in Israel. I think it's the largest quarried stone in the world of history and existence, and it was never used. I don't know if they couldn't move it or what, but it was like, I can't remember. I better not even try to quote a figure, but the scores of tons, scores of tons. A ton's 2,000 pounds. Scores like 100 or 200 or 300 tons that it weighed. And that was going to be a part of a pagan Roman temple. And they had to quarry it there, cut it just precisely. And they cut it out of solid rock right there. They were very skilled at this. They used hammers and they used saws. We find that even in the Old Testament, that they had saws made out of metal that would cut right through the stone. No power tools, though. No power tools. It's all done by hand. And they had ways of doing it, and they had ways of doing it so that those buildings are still around today, as we all know so well. But I think an earthquake hit shortly after this, and that big stone I was just talking about broke in half, so it was useless after that, so they left it there. But anyway, he prepared 1,000 wagons. He prepared 10,000 laymen, Jewish laymen, who were going to be the ones actually doing the work, basically in 3 areas: as stone cutters, as carpenters, and as craftsmen. Craftsmen in gold, silver, and bronze. The brass in the KJV is always generally a mistranslation, which doesn't concern us now. That's in the Old Testament anyway. You don't find that in the New. but craftsmen in gold, silver, and bronze. Stonecutters, carpenters, and craftsmen. Let's start with the stonecutters and see what their responsibilities were. It's really impressive. It's massive, the work they were involved in. It's beyond my imagination how people, I don't think you could even find people today who would be skilled enough to accomplish tasks like this. You become too dependent on, well, either other building materials. We certainly don't use 100-ton stones to build things anymore with, just too expensive, or on modern technology and power machinery. So the stonecutters would first of all be responsible for quarrying the stones. And I guess as now it was then, the larger the stone, the greater the value. I mean, it's a lot more impressive when you have one big, huge, massive thing to serve like as the arch or the lintel over a door or gate. And getting ahead of myself again, we'll try to be giving you all these statistics as we go along, but like some of the gates into the temple, I know what you have pictured, a little gate like you've been through, were 80 feet high. Now, 80 feet is taller than most trees that grow around here. If you know what feet are, 80 feet is a big distance. You don't find a whole lot of trees around here 80 feet tall. That's how tall the gates were. And, you know, they were so broad, I mean, it's so massive, a whole flood of pilgrims can go through there. And if we would just think, we would know it would have to be that way. Not necessarily that tall, because people aren't walking up in the air, but at least that broad, because you've got hundreds of thousands of pilgrims in Jerusalem at Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. But Herod wants to, outdo himself. People aren't going to be walking in the air. You could have it, 8 feet high, and then make it 1,000 feet wide if you want to. Well, he went up and out with it, and ended up with gates that were 75 to 80 feet high. So we're talking about the gate beautiful. We'll get to that later. Just what was that gate, and where was that? Acts 3, the gate beautiful? This isn't a little tiny gate, that has a little door and a little latch on it, and a little man sitting there on the front step. This is like the entrance to the Supreme Court building or something, or the Capitol building or something. It's just magnificent. And it's not like, there were just hundreds of people all around, beggars everywhere. It's not like there was just one little man and there were two men, Peter and John, going into the temple at that hour. Well, there were people everywhere, just floods of people around. So you got to keep increasing in your mind the size, your vision of everything. It's not small. It is immense and massive. Josephus tells us this. Some people have said he's exaggerating, but then again, we've got some surviving representative stones in Jerusalem to this day that are of Herodian masonry. And I'm no architectural buff, not yet anyway. I may get to that one of these days and get more proficient in it. But there are certain ways, I know some of the ways, there are certain ways you can tell the stones that were quarried under Herod's rule versus other times. He had a certain way that they had to be done. It's known as Herodian masonry. But Josephus tells us that some of the blocks that were used in the temple measured 8 feet by 8 feet by 77 feet. Now, 8's what? A typical ceiling, so you know about how big that is. And 8 the other way, lay it down, and then stretch it out, though. 77 feet. Now, some of you in building know what I'm talking about when I say 77 feet. Some of you women may not. You can't comprehend. 77 feet for a stone. There's a difference between 8 and 12-foot sheetrock. Is there not, brother? How about 77-foot sheetrock? Trying to tack that up somewhere. And it's not sheetrock. This is 8 by 8. This isn't 3/4 inch. This is 8 feet by 8 feet. You're going to move it. You're going to quarry it. Then you're going to move it. Then you're going to lift it 80 feet in the air and set it up as a lintel over a gate or a door. This is Herod's temple. You getting the picture? I hope I'm doing a good job so far. Just think, imagine. Even if Josephus is exaggerating, 77 by 8 by 8, which I don't necessarily think that he was, they were nevertheless immense, very huge, very large. Most of the rock was either alabaster or marble. There were some other kinds they used, but those were the two chief ones, and a whole lot of marble. I think you'll enjoy this study of the temple here because you're already familiar with some of these things in your own work habits or whatever you do, and you think whenever you have marble laid anywhere in a foyer or something, you get a little tiny bit out there just so you can say, we got marble. You know, you pay an arm and a leg. Just say, I got marble here. We're talking about 77 feet long, just marble everywhere is paved with marble. I mean, in prices today, it'd be probably billions of dollars spent on this. We think if we can tile a bathroom or something, just a little bit of it, it's just out of this world for the prices. And it's so small in comparison. And we're talking about little quarter-inch or half-inch stuff, not 8 feet thick by 8 feet by 70 feet long. They had to make cuts out of solid rock, columns. These columns held up what we'll study later, what was called the Royal Colonnade. There are 4 different colonnades. We know the names of 2 of them, Solomon's Porch and the Royal Colonnade. That's on the east and south, respectively. We don't know the west and the north. Stone lattices were carved 5 feet high to separate the Jewish from the Gentile courts, and several feet high to separate the women's from the men's and the men's from the priests. We'll see later the difference between the various courts in the temple precincts. But stone lattice work, you know what lattices are, what a lattice is. Like in the Old Testament in 2 Kings 1, lattice work covered the window, and one of the foreign pagan kings fell out of it and hurt himself. Well, he was a Jewish king, but he was a pagan one. So these were stone lattices, 5 feet high, carved to separate Jewish from Gentile courts. So these were stone lattices, 5 feet high, carved to separate Jewish from Gentile courts, or also called the outer from the inner courts. And then once you got into the inner courts, the Jewish ones, then several feet high, like 3 to 4 feet high, to separate the women's from the men's court, also known as the court of Israel, and the men's, known as the court of Israel, from the court of the priests. I'm just giving you some of the work of the stone cutters, the masons, what they had to do. Also, they had to carve stone tablets and carve writing in them at intervals on the outer lattice, that is the lattice that separates the inner from the outer court, or the Jewish from the Gentile one. Written some in Greek, some in Latin, at various intervals, to warn Gentiles on pain of death of coming inside the Jewish court. And we'll study this later on in a little more detail. But tablets were carved, placed on the lattices that separate the outer from the inner, the Gentile from the Jewish court, warning in 2 different languages, different tablets in different languages, Greek and Latin, Gentiles on pain of death of going beyond that point. And there were various number of gates that led from the outer court to the inner court. And there'll be verses, like someone said for the Tribulation Temple Revelation, that I gave you the passage, Revelation chapter 11, verse 2, but the court which is without the temple leave out and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles. And the holy city shall they tread underfoot 3.5 years, 40 and 2 months. So that verse alone, along with the first verse, speaks of an inner and an outer court, or a Jewish and a Gentile one. Don't worry about the passage. We'll be back to it because we'll need to use it later. One of these tablets, Josephus tells us about them. Their historicity has been proven in a discovery of one of them in 1871 and a discovery of another one of them in 1936. I also mentioned this on the tape I did concerning Herod's building projects some years ago. But one of these tablets was discovered in 1871 and another in 1936, warning the Gentiles on pain of death of entering. Now, we know what the inscription is. I'll read that to you some other time before we're through with these few studies we want to do about the temple. And also, you'll be interested to know where there's a New Testament reference to this point that I'm under here, the lattice work with the stone tablets and so forth. There is a New Testament reference to that in a very cryptic passage. And then furthermore, if that wasn't enough for them to do, they had the temple building itself to cut stones for. Now, as we'll see later, some different men were involved in this than the 10,000 laymen that I mentioned earlier tonight, but still, that has to be done. And we'll describe what the temple building itself looked like for you later. So what I've given you thus far then would be the colonnades that surround it, the stonework, the columns that go into that, several hundred of these columns, the various lattices, carved lattices that would separate each of the courts or the necessary courts. We've talked about the gates or the doors that would lead from one to another. We've talked about the tablets there. We've talked about the temple building itself. Then the leftover work, which would be immense in itself, would be to pave with marble of all different beautiful colors, greens and oranges with gold specks in them and so forth, the entire courtyard. Which I don't want to get ahead of myself tonight telling you how big the courtyard was. I'll tell you in acres later how big it was. And you can look back on it. But in acres, not in feet, in acres, it was all paved with beautiful, exquisite marble, with the best being saved for the court of the Gentiles. That's because Herod was a Gentile. He lavished expense on the Gentile court and left the Jews alone. But this isn't like some old dusty place you'd visit in Rome or Greece today, with just a bunch of blocks laying around. This is exquisite. Green and orange and blue marble with gold specks in it, measured by acres. Now, an acre is like the yard that we have right now. That's an acre. Now, you start multiplying that when you find out how many acres are involved. How'd you like to just to pave our yard with solid marble out there? That's the courtyard there. That would cost you a pretty penny, as they say. So there we have the stone cutters, the masons, their responsibility. Then I said, secondly, we come to the carpenters. The carpenters didn't have that much work because more work was done in stone in those days than in wood. But any large project has to have a wooden substructure to it. And so the carpenters were responsible for the sanctuary substructure. And I can't even express to you now how immense the temple, the actual sanctuary it was. We'll get to that later. But there were just rooms upon rooms upon rooms upon rooms. All you think of is, well, you go inside and there was the holy place, the altar of incense, the table of showbread, and the lamp, the 7 lampstands there, and then beyond that, beyond a thick wall-to-wall, ceiling-to-floor curtain would be the Holy of Holies. And that would be the building. Well, hardly. That wouldn't even be the majority of the building. That'd be a small part of the temple building. Those two things that you think of as making up the whole temple, the holy place and the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. Well, that wouldn't even make up a large portion. That'd be a very, very small portion of the temple building. You had stairs. I mean, there were cubby holes running everywhere. Mice would have fun in there. I mean, it'd be like a nest of mice because it went up so high, up, many stories with stairs going up, winding around, and rooms here, and closets there, and doors and passageways just everywhere. So the carpenters would be responsible for a lot of the woodwork that had to be done in there. They'd be responsible for fixing the overhead beams. They would be responsible for And here was a big responsibility of theirs for roofing the colonnades with paneling. And this was raised paneling. They didn't just tack some plywood up there. This wood was, as you could probably guess, imported cedar of Lebanon, the most valuable wood of that day. See, Herod can afford to do this in his day. Zerubbabel couldn't. So you've got to picture these 100-plus foot columns, and they're going to have a roof over it. And as you would look up, you would just see, with all types of design and intricate work, you would see cedar of Lebanon wood paneling, raised wood paneling up there. And then you'd have something else like stone on the top of that. They would also, the carpenters, be responsible for the substructure of the gates. You would have wood in the interior of the gates, and then you'd have something over the outside of that. Kind of like the furniture you buy today. It's got something on the inside and something else on the outside. But at least this is more valuable, though. You got cedar of Lebanon on the inside and gold on the outside. I wouldn't mind having inferior substructure if it's cedar of Lebanon. When it's a lot of sawdust glued together, that's another matter. But they didn't have any of that here. No sawdust glued together. And then thirdly, we have the role of the craftsmen. Craftsmen. These were the artificers in gold and silver and bronze. These were highly skilled people who could do this work. But he had 10,000 men. It wasn't as though it was such a rare thing to do that only 2 men in Israel could do it. There were a lot of people that could do this. There was a lot of need for it, a lot of building going on in Herod's day. Josephus is really famous for giving us a description from his own personal life of what it was like traveling to Jerusalem from the east to the west, coming over the top of the Mount of Olives early in the morning with the sun just having risen, and being nearly blinded by the sun's reflection off the gold plating which covered everything in the temple. Josephus has a famous passage in his book about that. Now, the Talmud cautions going too far. Josephus is prone to exaggerate, but the Talmud itself does say that almost no expense was spared in the building of Herod's temple. The Talmud tells us that Herod intended to overlay everything with gold. But after he went so far, the Jewish leader said, enough is enough. But in any case, the gold and the silver and the bronze would have been in many different places, especially covering all of these immense gates I've just described, most of them gold-plated. After all, remember one of the gates was called what in Acts 3? Gate Beautiful. That was its name. I'll get you thinking about that. You say, well, if they were all plated in gold, why would one be called Gate Beautiful? They all were. Well, there must have been something unique and different about this gate, and there was, as we'll see later. I'm giving you lots of hints of where we're going just to make you curious. But I can't cover it all in one night anyway. But in any case, the gold and silver and bronze would be many different places. It would be on the gates. It would be on the temple building itself, for sure. And most of the rock in the temple building itself was white, pure white, milk white. So as you came over the top of the Mount of Olives in the morning with the sun to your back and your face facing the front of the temple and the so-called Eastern Gate, it would have been a dazzling display before you. Whether Josephus is exaggerating or not is really a moot question. It would have been a dazzling display before you of gold, silver, bronze, marble, beautiful white stone, glistening in the morning sun everywhere. And Josephus says, in effect, it was enough to take your breath away. Most of all the gates to gain entrance were double gates covered with gold and silver made of cedar of Lebanon. Now, there are some other specific things I'll say for a little later, more description of what the temple building itself looked like, where people such as the craftsmen would be needed for that. But I think enough is enough of what I've said thus far tonight. So we've looked at the stone cutters, the carpenters, the craftsmen, some of the beauty of the temple involved, all at, well, I won't say Herod's expense because he used the temple treasury to do it, but all under Herod's rule and his guiding force. If you open your Bible over to John chapter 2, I just want to take the time to look at one passage in the New Testament tonight. John 2, 13 through 22 is the most famous reference to Herod's temple in the New Testament. And we see here that the work was so massive that at the time of Jesus, it had been going on continuously for 46 years. This wasn't a project that he started in December of 20 BC and finished in April of 16 BC. The time of Jesus, according to John 2, the work had been going on continuously for 46 years. Read along with me, if you will, in this passage. And the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem and found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves and the changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the changers' money and overthrew the tables. And said unto them that sold doves, Take these things hence, make not my Father's house an house of merchandise. Now he's saying that about the temple, most of whose work had been under the hand of Herod. And he said, This is my Father's house. And his disciples remember that it was written, The zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. Then answered the Jews and said unto him, What sign showest thou unto us, seeing thou doest these things? Now the Jews had a certain belief in Judaism of that day that in order for one to exercise supreme authority in the temple, and one not be the high priest, then he had to show a sign. He had to demonstrate a sign, and if he could demonstrate a sign, that would be proof of the fact he was the promised Messiah. So there's something behind John 2:18 when the Jews are asking him according to their own religious law of that day. Now there's no law in the Old Testament saying this. This is their own law of Judaism. What sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou doest these things? He took authority over the financial transactions of the temple precinct itself. And they're asking, well, you've got authority to do this. What's your sign then to prove that you've got this authority? Meaning that if you can give us a sign, you'll be the Messiah. Well, he gives them one. But they didn't quite get what he was meaning. Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple. Now you think of what I just described to you about the temple. And that's their conception of it. Destroy this temple. That would be a feat in itself. The Romans did it, though, in AD 70. Well, that's not the point of the passage. Let's finish it. And in 3 days, I will raise it up. Well, that just knocked them off their religious stool. Because they could look around them and look at this work. It took skilled masons, carpenters, and craftsmen. This man is saying, if you tear it down, I can rebuild this whole temple in 3 days. Look what they go on to say. Then said the Jews, 46 years was the temple in building, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? You see, unless you know what we've looked at tonight, you lose some of the impact of it all. You've got to put yourself there as these Jews are standing there knowing this is a fabulous, marvelous, expansive, expensive work that's been going on for 46 years, 5 decades. And this man is saying destroy it, which we could do, but that'd be hard. That's going to take a few months or maybe a year to destroy all of this. And you're saying that in 3 days you can rebuild the whole thing. Well, we know that's not what he meant. John tells us, verse 21, but he spake of the temple of his body. Rather a mystical passage here that went right over the comprehension of the Jews. Since John gives us the interpretation in verse 21, when we go back then and compare it to verse 19, I think we have a greater miracle on our hands. It'd be one thing to rebuild Herod's temple in 3 days. It's another thing for a dead man to raise himself from the dead. That's what John wants us to see as so incredible about the statement that he made. The Jews were floored at it, rightly so, thinking that he meant the earthly temple, because to rebuild that in 3 days would probably be a miracle. But how much more a miracle when Jesus said, destroy this temple, speaking of his body, and in 3 days, he doesn't say the Father will raise it up. That's said elsewhere in the Gospels and the New Testament. He doesn't say the Spirit will raise it up. That's said elsewhere. He said, I will raise it up, which also is said elsewhere. I lay my life down. I will take my life up again. There's the miracle John wants us to see. The miracle of all that a dead man could say that as a dead man I can raise myself. With John knowing, we'll think, well, the normal, ordinary, living man couldn't raise a dead man. How much more a dead man raising himself? But the Jews said 46 years was his temple and building without reared up in 3 days, but he spake of the temple of his body. When therefore he was risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this unto them, and they believed the Scripture and the word which Jesus had said. Now, I'll tell you another story about this, and then I want to say a few more things before we conclude tonight. This passage has, again, one of these personal references in my own past life. Whenever I was, 16, I'd been saved less than a year. We had a Presbyterian church camp that we went to every fall, every year. I don't think I missed it, but maybe once from, year 0. Before I was born. I think I was there in my mother's womb whenever she was there, but because she was carrying me, and we went every October, and with me being born in December or in January, I'd have to be there in her womb. But anyway, we had a Bible quiz at this camp every year. And the year before, 75, the year I'm talking about, we just ran around and got involved in everything. The boys in the camp, we didn't have any time for this religious business, and we hated going to church, and if we could skip the religious programs, we'd skip them. Well, by the next year, whenever I was 16, I'd been saved since the winter earlier, and I had the baptism for 2 months now. And we had a quiz question. We divided up in groups, and I skipped all the things the boys were doing, and I went to be where the adults were. I wanted to be wherever religious things were going on, which was a total change from the way I was the year before. Right. And one of the questions was, how long had Herod's temple been under construction, in the life and ministry of Jesus, whenever he comes to the end of his life and ministry? And, of course, in our Presbyterian church, nobody knew the Bible. I mean, to ask a question like that, it'd be better to ask, what's the fourth gospel? People would probably get that easier, if they could get it at all, than to ask a technical question about dates of the building of the temple. And I've never forgotten this. That was one of the questions asked. They pulled it out of a hat, and they asked us, my group, which was mostly adults, elders and deacons in the church, and my mother was in the group, and I was in the group as a 16-year-old. Well, I'm not telling the story to brag on myself because I missed the question, but maybe through missing it to tell you something else about myself, though. Everyone was talking, what is it? What would you say, 5 years? I don't know, 175, just guessing back and forth. No one knew. And I was racking my brain. You couldn't use your Bible. And I was racking my brain. And I knew what it was because I had read it before. I'd read my Bible. I mean, I actually read it. Most people hadn't, I don't think, in our church. And the number I came up with was 36. Missed it. I was thinking of 3 instead of 4. And I said 36. And they believed me in my group. I said, because I think I know. Everyone else was guessing. And mine was more certain than theirs was. Well, so we called it out, whoever the leader was of our group, and we missed the question, but I was closer than anybody else, and the other group never got it either. But in thinking back on that, what was interesting to me in preparing for this message here tonight was the fact, here you've got someone saved not even a year and baptized in the Holy Spirit just over 2 months, and I'd already read enough of the Bible to remember a date figure like that hidden away in John 2. You know, I must have been busy. I don't know how I ever saw that, but I must have been busy reading in 2 months' period of time to remember a date figure. 36. I was pretty close. I knew it was a 6, and it was in those low numbers somewhere. So we missed it, but I've never forgotten it since then, though. That's one good thing about missing questions. Some of the ones you get, you forget later on. But I generally never forget anything that I miss. So yes, it had been under construction for 46 years. What's interesting about it, however, is it's not completed until the year AD 64. A total of 83 years for the construction of Herod's temple. And what's so good and helpful about this verse in John 2, verse 20, in this regard anyway, is that it helps us to date the life and ministry of Christ. Because we know from other records Herod began his temple in 20 BC. So all you do is add 46 years to that. And what do you have? Around 26 AD, which would have to be the approximate date for what's going on in the life and ministry of Jesus at this time. And dating his life and ministry is rather notoriously difficult, so it helps to have a reference like this, and we do in John 2 and verse 20. So anyway, it's not completed until AD 64. That means, and this is kind of the irony of it all, what I was headed toward tonight, that means that it stands in its completed form for all of 6 whole years. After 83 years under construction, it stands in its magnificent completed form for all of 6 years, and it is razed to the ground by the Romans in AD 70. That's the irony of it all. To spend 83 years, to have it last 6 years, to have it destroyed beyond recognition. Well, back to the date AD 64. Whenever the temple is completed, there's a lot of rejoicing, but there are also 18,000 men out of work in Jerusalem. Some people are rejoicing, not these 18,000 men, though. You got your 10,000 laymen. A lot of others that we'll see later on were involved. 18,000 men. Now that means double-digit unemployment rate in Jerusalem in AD 64 whenever the temple is completed. So, Agrippa II, whom we've studied earlier, used the temple treasury. They always use the Jews' money to do work to take pride in themselves. Agrippa II used the temple treasury to employ these men to pave the entire city of Jerusalem. You know, to keep the men busy. You know, it's a WPA type program. Find something to keep the men busy. Works Progress Administration. I think back in those years, it really stood for "we piddle around." That's what these men are doing. You know, if you work for the government and you run out of things to do, you type telephone numbers out of a phone book to look like you're busy. Well, that's the literal truth. And the highway department's just a little bit under working for the government. Somebody's always leaning on a broom, instructing someone else leaning on another broom to instruct somebody else to act like you're busy and drink coffee. So they do. Two segments of this paving have actually been found. They paved the entire city of Jerusalem. Two segments found. One near the west wall, also known as the Wailing Wall today in Jerusalem, 40 feet below the present ground level today. That shows how much debris has fallen and accumulated over the centuries in Jerusalem. In other words, the city 2,000 years ago was 40 feet lower than it is right now. But two segments have been found. One near the west wall, 40 feet below the present surface, and it supports the stones. This won't mean anything to you now, but it will perhaps later. That supported Robinson's Arch, which was the major entrance and exit into the temple precincts. And the other segment of this was found near the pool of Siloam. Between 64 AD and the outbreak of the war with Rome in 66, and the war lasts 4 years, more construction was planned to keep these men employed after they finished paving Jerusalem. So they planned to put in new foundations and to heighten the temple by 35 feet. The timber from Lebanon had actually been secured whenever the war broke out in AD 66, and of course that was the end of the building because they closed themselves, the fanatical Jews, in the temple compound, and it was one of the last things to be stormed and overcome by the Romans.